Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Charles, for that really good talk. I'm actually going to quote you on this one as well, so maybe I'll put you on the spot for some questions afterwards. I thought I'd start off with just a bit about myself. There's been a bit of an introduction there. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. So yeah, about 20 years experience, most of that in New Zealand, but I've done work in Australia and quite a lot in the UK. I studied here in Palmerston North a wee while ago now, so I did my degree at Massey. Most of my professional experience is in design, but I started out my career in for Environment Bay of Plenty. So I was a consent officer to start off with. So I was, at the start of my career, I was looking at permitting discharges, going to the Environment Court, council hearings, so I'm quite familiar with the New Zealand process. Since that, got chartered and a member of IChemE, which is the UK institution for chemical engineers, and I'm currently based in Melbourne. I think some of the advertising said I was in Brisbane, but I've been there a few times, but no, I'm in Melbourne. So I'll just give you an overview of what I'll talk about. So really this talks a lot about, well, the first part of it, about an overview of some trends in New Zealand and Australia, and sort of a bit of history about where and how and to some respects why systems have changed with time and what they started out like and where they're going. Some examples, as I understand, the plant here will be required to meet some low nutrient standards. So some examples of some nutrient standards in NZ. There's some plants I've been involved in and plants I'm familiar with. And also ones that are on the drawing board as far as new plants are concerned and what those have to achieve and maybe how, or hopefully how they'll achieve them. The bit that I'll probably quote Charles on will be this bit here: limits of technology and reliability. Very important as far as when you're talking to the regulator about how you measure some of these things, how often, and how certain you want to be at the outcomes. It's very, very important. There's been a bit of talk already from Charles and a few questions which I'll probably sort of delve into a little bit more, as well as some of the standards for reuse in Australia, and these are specific to Victoria where I'm based, and how those relate to New Zealand. And at the end there I'll talk about some of the stuff that's happening from our UK team on looking at how to measure value when you're looking at options in wastewater treatment. So, and using carbon as a way to measure resource use and also look at which options stack up over which other ones. So basically what I'll start off with here is just a brief overview of where things have happened, and I'll sort of go into a little bit of sort of diversion here and there, and based on some of the questions that have come up in Charles's discussion. So really early on, this is a picture of Mangere for those who know New Zealand. So this is what Mangere started out like when it was built in the 60s. And while there's a bit of pre-treatment over here, the majority of the system was lagoons. So this is the Manukau Harbour. And some of you might be familiar with this project and this treatment plant, but basically back in the day this is actually a reclaim. So the engineers decided in their wisdom to block off part of Manukau Harbour and build some lagoons. So these were massive lagoons, probably the biggest with a few exceptions in the southern hemisphere. And they provided wastewater treatment to Auckland for quite a while. I suppose back then, and particularly with Mangere as well, not so much these days, is that reticulation and treatment was really about public health. So getting the wastewater away from people, out of centres, and treating it, stabilising it a bit and putting it into the environment. And I suppose, whoops, if I go back, sorry. Wastewater engineers were called public health engineers till, I don't know when that change happened, but to reflect that really, that a lot of wastewater treatment was about protecting public health. I'll go into that a little bit later. So a lot of treatment was was based on lagoons, and there's some very large systems in New Zealand, as I mentioned. Mangaree's probably the biggest. Rosedale on the north shore of Auckland, if anybody else is familiar with that one. Christchurch is another lagoon-based system, which is very big. And a lot of the smaller centres around NZ have had or still have pond systems. In Australia, not too dissimilar. Werribee, which, if anyone's familiar with Melbourne, this is the Western treatment plant. It takes about 500 megalitres a day, so it's quite a large one. It's about 2/3 of the population of Greater Melbourne. And until about 20 years ago, that was a lagoon-based system, and you can actually, it's quite a significant site now for wildlife, etc. Some of the plants still has lagoons, but basically at that stage it was all based on lagoons and since been upgraded. So lagoons, actually nothing wrong with them really. This is the Werribee treatment plant, the one I just mentioned in Victoria. It's not all that far away from where I live, so you can see it's large lagoons, massive lagoon system, probably the biggest you're likely to see. If you ever get the chance to visit it, it's a really, very interesting place to visit. And I'll go into this a bit later, but here's a little activated sludge plant stuck right in the middle anyway. So advantages of lagoon treatment and why they were so popular is really because they were good at stabilising waste before it was released into the environment, still are. They're very reasonably cheap to operate, easy to operate. There's not a lot of skill required, not a lot of maintenance required. And one of the other things about them as well is there's a long time until the sludge needs to come out. So a lot of pond systems may be decades before people have to worry about desludging. Whereas in more high rate plants, maybe you need to, that's something you need to consider on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. And a system like these, don't have to worry about it for quite a while. Although when you do have to worry about it, it's an issue. So disadvantages though, and some of these are being mentioned by Charles as well, is that some have been plagued with odour. This one in particular has odour issues. Nutrients, as people get more interested in nitrogen and phosphorus, lagoon systems work some of the time, but not others. And quality as far as control. You see on a system like this, just looking, I'll pick on this one for a minute. In this massive system here, there's not a lot of things you can do, not a lot of levers to pull or buttons to press if things aren't going well. You're really at the subject of the elements. And while that's not such a bad thing, if things aren't going well, there's not a lot you can do, and not a lot you can do quickly. So that's one disadvantage. And like I say, you're really at the mercy of the weather as well, and that's things like day-to-day weather as well as seasons, etc., as well. And obviously these things are open to the air, so different things grow in them at different times of year, which can cause issues as well. And in the Australian context, lagoons are still, there's a lot of them around, and for those reasons, and they're used a lot for smaller communities. This is one I was at the other day. This is in Mildura, up in the northeast of Victoria, which is sort of in the middle of nowhere. It's about, when you get there, you get out of the airport and the first sign says 800 k's to Melbourne, 600 to Sydney and 400 to Adelaide, so it's it is a bit in the middle of nowhere. But one of the really interesting things, I've never been to a plant like this before, but I was asking the operator, well, how does this work? Where do you discharge to? And he looked at me and said, well, no water comes out at the end. I'm like, well, sorry, how does that work? He said, well, actually here, these guys get about 150 mils of rainfall a year, and their evaporation rate's about 2 metres. So water goes in, water never comes out. So I thought that's quite a handy process to have. And I said, well, you don't have any issues with your discharge then? He says, no, but we have issues with some, you can't quite see it in the photo here, but these things are a very interesting colour. So that sort of thing in these small remote communities is good because they've done nothing to this plant for years and probably don't have to. But that isn't going to work in somewhere like New Zealand where the rainfall's high. It's just not ever going to happen. In other parts of Victoria, lagoon systems, they're often used with what they call winter storage. So They store all their flows over winter, and then when the dry season comes, which seems to be most of the time over there, they irrigate. So there's not necessarily any discharge to water if they can avoid it. And when the weather's extra wet or when there's seasonal things going on, they have to apply to the EPA to be able to discharge to water. So that's quite an interesting thing that they don't actually call that discharge to land like we might. They call it reuse. So and there's different standards for that, which I'll come on to later. So basically that's really a bit of a rundown on sort of some lagoon systems and where they're being used and why they were used in NZ, I suppose. And then I suppose due to some of those issues and things like Charles said as well, intensification, people, cities getting bigger, more people wanting to live there, etc., land becoming more valuable, which is obviously an issue for some people up north as well, is that more compact treatment processes such as activated sludge started to get looked at a lot more. And I suppose they have the ability to remove nitrogen. And one of the things that happened, I suppose around in the early 80s, was that a lot of research and things was being undertaken in South Africa. I'm not sure why Cape Town in particular was where all the action was, but it was. And they found that some of these processes could remove phosphorus. A lot of them were able to remove nitrogen, and they did a lot of work to figure out how these systems work and try to understand them better. And that was really an explosion in knowledge, I suppose, of how those systems worked and how they could be applied. So you would have already heard Charles talk about Bardenfo. That's a system that was developed during this time. UCT, modified UCT, there's a whole bunch. If you open a wastewater treatment textbook for nutrient removal, probably more than half, I'd say probably 3/4 of the processes, apart from, say, VIP and a few others, were developed in that time. So really what this did is it meant that, I wouldn't say suddenly, but this sort of process was much more understood, and people knew its limitations and how it could be applied to different situations. So at that stage, New Zealand, I'd say Australia as well, a lot of systems were mostly lagoons, but then, and I refer to Rotorua here, there were some early adopters for activated sludge because of those advantages, particularly of nutrient removal. So around that time, there was still a majority of passive systems, I would call them, as lagoons, but people started to get a lot more interested in these things, mainly because of compactness and nutrients. And then basically that really led on to a lot of these plants being implemented around the place. So once people got an understanding, some track record, some history about how these things worked, as well as the research that was going on, a lot of plants, because of nutrients, because of odour, because of controllability issues. And I'd say Mangere here, actually my house is just over here. This particular plant had massive problems with midges. So, trying to control that in such a massive area, the neighbours over here were not happy, and particularly with the odour as well. So what they did is say, look, our quality's not what we want it to be. We're having these other environmental issues. What can we do? So at that stage, which is in the 90s, Mangere was upgraded to activated sludge, and that's the Mangere plant there. A lot of you are probably familiar with that. It's going through another upgrade now. Rosedale, which is the second largest plant in Auckland, that's about 60 megalitres a day, so in the same sort of ballpark as what you're talking about here. That was upgraded as well. That's going another upgrade at the moment. Same in Melbourne, where I'm at the moment. Western treatment plant, that little activated sludge thing you saw on that picture before, went in about that time. And the Eastern treatment plant, a lot of growth corridor in the eastern side of Port Phillip Bay. Activated sludge went in there as well, because the land areas, etc., was just becoming so valuable, and they really wanted to start protecting Port Phillip Bay, that the process has shrunk and they got much more focused on nutrients. In New Zealand about this time, in fact, it was a bit earlier than the 2000s, but in 1991, obviously the RMA came into being in New Zealand, which changed the scene quite a lot. and a lot more consideration of a cultural understanding of where and how wastewater could be discharged. And I suppose I wasn't working around 91, but sort of in the mid-90s when the RMA was really coming into its own. So working with trying to regulate and looking at how plants were permitted, and how you went through optioneering, and etc., which this forum's part of. And are there any Australians in the room? Any chance before I slag them off? Okay, just a couple. So maybe block your ears. One of the things I really noticed, and I'd say is really, I suppose, shocked me a bit, is that this never comes into anything I mean, it's very token where in Victoria. What we're doing here is a lot better. It's obviously got its issues, and not everybody agrees, but the understanding and the effort is orders of magnitude better here than it is in Victoria. So around this time, this is the Rotorua plant, and at that stage in the early 90s, Alison, you can probably update me on the dates if I've got them slightly wrong, is that there's a lot of empty tanks here, but these tanks here before the MBR went in were activated sludge with primary tanks and discharge into the lake. And then this plant was re-permitted, and there was it was originally going to be discharged into the Kaituna catchment, which is up the far end, if anyone's familiar with the geography of Rotorua. And it went through a Waitangi Tribunal hearing, and that gave birth, I suppose, to the land treatment system, which is there at the moment. So I suppose during this time there was a change in the technology that you could use, and also where more of a focus on going away from majority of water-based discharges to start looking at other options such as land. So around this time, obviously the Rotorua scheme, which I'm sure Alison will talk about quite a lot after lunch, and which I've been involved in quite a lot as well, was implemented. And also there's another scheme there which has worked really well, actually one of the best around, I think, for land disposal is Taupo. So that's gone through a few different iterations, and I think, again, Alison, you've got some slides to talk through that. So both those systems were implemented, and they're still working at the moment. And interestingly enough, those were actually both systems, more in Taupo, but to some extent Rotorua as well, were focused on trying to control nutrients within the land as well as within the treatment process. So I was trying to couple the two together and say, well, if we do one thing in here, how does that affect the land, and what's the balance between removing stuff here with energy versus putting it on the land? So I suppose Rotorua and Taupo are quite similar in that they are quite successful land treatment, land disposal systems, but they have different goals. Rotorua removes a lot of its nutrients in the treatment plant as well as in the forest system, whereas Taupo actually runs their system, and it's designed to not remove any nutrients within the system itself, but all onto the land. But they've got a unique set of circumstances there with climate, soil types, the volumes of their flows, etc., which make that feasible. So going back to Australia, you may have heard this, the Millennium Drought in Australia. This was a very serious event. And in 2006, at the height of this, Melbourne's drinking water reservoirs were at less than 25% capacity and going down. And there was no sign of rain. So it hadn't rained properly for about 5-6 years at that stage. Melbourne's, Victorians complain about the weather a lot, but it only gets about 600 mils of rain a year, which is, I think you guys have had that in the last couple of weeks, so I don't really have much to complain about. But what it did, and what I suppose Charles mentioned as well, is that changed behaviour all of a sudden. Suddenly treating wastewater and discharging it changed from getting the stuff away from people back into the environment to what do we do with this and how can we reuse it, because we haven't got any and it's starting to run out. So just on this, I haven't got this in the slides here, but just looking at when you're talking about indirect potable reuse, Australia decided not to do that, and I'm not too sure what the history of that. So they have now designed, if you like, indirect potable reuse schemes. They decided to go for desalination and reuse of wastewater, of treated wastewater for different purposes, for industry and things, but they weren't prepared to go that step for whatever reason to indirect potable reuse. So, but still, oops, hang on, jumping ahead here. The drivers were more focused on pathogen removal, so it's all about, at that stage for reuse, about protecting, and probably going back to the first point about public health, more focused on providing pathogen removal, so removing bugs. So reuse schemes came along with multiple systems on the end of them, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And I suppose the drivers weren't so much about environmental issues such as nitrogen and phosphorus, although those are still very relevant. It was more about how can we reuse water and how can we be more water efficient. And someone asked the question before about, I can't remember who it was now, about concentrations changing in wastewater. And if you look at data from Victoria, you can see when the drought happened from how the quality of the incoming wastewater changed, the concentrations go up markedly. And a similar trend, they haven't actually come back to what they were. So people have got used, and I suppose building standards and things have changed, so the use hasn't got back to where it was. It's gone up from when it was really, really dry, but the characteristics are still quite a lot stronger than what you would have found before the drought. So water reuse schemes. This is a UF system here. So typically these systems in Victoria and around Australia, ultrafiltration, so that's a first barrier to virus, ultraviolet disinfection, and then chlorine dosing. That's basically the three stages, and on the front of those is usually an activated sludge plant, and that's more to do with getting good enough quality water so these downstream processes work. Nutrients is important as well, but these systems are really looking with these types of things to get pathogen barriers, so all about protecting health. And each of those systems you have to apply to the local regulator to get, or the EPA, to get different credits for the different parts of the process. Pretty similar to what you said, Charles. Also, Australia being the lucky country has salinity issues with their water, quite serious. We don't have those here in New Zealand. Probably no one's ever heard of those before, but this is a very serious issue in Australia. And a lot of these systems force people to use reverse osmosis to desalinate their water before they put it back on for reuse, because it just completely ruins the ground. So the reasons for salinity are, some of it's to do with ageing infrastructure, so leaks of saline water, and some of it's to do with natural groundwater is very saline there as well because of the environment. And also, if you leave water outside in some parts of Australia, it disappears pretty fast and the salts are left behind. So it's a major issue. So these are water companies around Melbourne. Barwon Water, they have a system with RO and all these systems on it as well for industrial reuse. Melbourne Water, they don't do the third pipe themselves, but one of the local water utilities has their own salt reduction plant, and they put for new developments they're putting in third pipe systems. So you've probably heard about that. That's reuse water that goes directly to the house through, I think, purple pipe. So that's really called third pipe systems. Gippsland Water out in the, east of, out in the 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 east of of the Greater Melbourne area. They're in industrial reuse, Gippsland Water Factory. Some people might have heard of that. That's quite the major plant they have there, and that's industrial reuse again for a paper mill. And South East Water, they don't have major industry there, but they use, or were planning on using, a lot of the water for non-potable reuse. So that's for irrigating sports fields, et cetera, and crop irrigation. So we don't have these issues in New Zealand. I'm quite lucky. I mean, the rainfall means that the goals of what we do are sometimes quite different, and we definitely don't, in most cases anyway, have any salinity issues. So for reuse, we're unlikely, and I'll come on to RO in a bit later, unlikely to have to use reverse osmosis in most situations to clean up water because we don't have salinity issues in the first place. So I suppose there's a bit of an overview there, but then what?